Good day. Thank you for joining us for the State of Node.js Core Fireside Chat. I'm Christy Anderson with the marketing team here at Joyent. I'll be handling our housekeeping items and then handing it off to our moderator. This webinar is being streamed, so please make sure your volume is turned up, so on whatever device you are listening. We are recording this session and will be posting on our website in the next few days and sending out to all attendees. During our chat, we will be mentioning resources available in the open source community. We've included those links in the resource folder at the bottom of your screen, and we will also include those links in our follow-up email from the webinar. Our panelists will be fielding questions from our audience. To submit your question, click the QA button at the bottom of your screen. And now let me go through the flow for our webinar today. First off, we'll do a quick State of Node perspective. And then we're going to open it up to our panelists and get some early suggested topics from our audience, and we'll be covering those. And then we'll be opening it up to the audience. Questions are welcome, so please submit them. Now I'm going to hand it off to Sean Johnson, who will be moderating our panel today. Sean works at Joyent and is in charge of our commercial business. And with that, Sean, take it away.
Thanks, Christy. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone joining us today. It's a great turnout. Thank you for participating in the latest of our Fireside Chat webinars, and we're very excited to talk about the state of Node. Again, my name is Sean Johnson, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. I've been with Joyent for about 9 years, and I currently oversee Joyent's commercial support business, and have responsibilities for both Triton, which is our open source cloud platform that makes widespread use of Node throughout its service plane, as well as the enterprise support offering that we have for our Node users. And for those of you on the call today that are new to our Fireside Chats, we intend these to be casual, open-ended dialogues and obviously as insightful as possible. And our team on the call today is entirely remote and distributed, so we're going to have an audio-only concept of the Fireside today. And I have a few slides to keep us on track initially with some of the big picture items, but we're going to dig more into the technical topics and your questions right after that. And I'm going to try to get to all the questions during the discussion today, but for any that we don't get to, we'll look to post some of those responses, perhaps in a follow-up blog or even directly with some of you if need be. So let's jump in and meet the panelists. So first up is Colin Ihrig, and I think most of, many of you at least in our online audience know Colin directly or are familiar with Colin from his work within the project. In the community over the years, or maybe seen him speaking at events. Colin's been a member of the technical steering committee since early 2015, and he's a collaborator on libuv and Happy. Colin's the author of Pro Node.js for developers, as well as a co-author for the full stack JavaScript development with me. So welcome, Colin.
Hi everybody.
Joining Colin? Yeah. So joining Colin is Wyatt Preul. And Wyatt's a longtime contributor to Node and an original collaborator on the Happy framework as well from Node's early days when he was helping build one of the largest mobile e-commerce platforms in the world. Wyatt's also a contributor to the Seneca Toolkit for microservices, and he's co-authored developing a Happy Edge and professional community server themes and professional community server projects. So welcome, Wyatt.
Hey, y'all.
And alongside Colin and Wyatt is Lloyd Benson. Lloyd has many years of experience architecting, contributing, and developing Node applications at a range of scale. And he has a focus on equipping DevOps teams with tools to help make for smooth production experiences. And Lloyd's also credited with co-authoring the Developing a Happy Edge from his days working with the project scale. And if I may say so myself, he has an excellent singing voice as well. So welcome, Lloyd.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Great. And so thank you to all three of our panelists. They actually lead an internal team here of Node engineers that work not only on Joyent Samsung projects in support of our cloud technologies and open source technologies, but they also assist Joyent's Node enterprise support customers seeking guidance and debugging support, training, code review, best practices. So we've got a unique privilege here of kind of working with instructors and practitioner roles, both here at Joyent and as well as with our customers. So welcome and thank you to all of the panelists for participating today. So, now that we've kind of introduced ourselves, and thank you all again for jumping on, I just hope everybody would take a brief moment and just introduce yourselves to us as well before we jump in. I promise we're not going to do many polls here, just a couple here at the beginning, but I'd love to just understand a little bit more about the roles that we have on so we can make sure to tailor and emphasize some topics that are important to all of you. So I'll give you a couple minutes here, or actually a couple seconds. We'll skip through quickly, and we'll see how everybody is here today. All right, so I'll jump to our poll. Look at that. As suspected here, we've got a ton of developers on the phone, and I know we didn't get quite everybody in time there, but excited to have you, and I think this is going to be a lot of great content for developers, certainly, and DevOps. And then my last quick poll of the day, I promise, just how do you describe your use of Node? And I wouldn't say just your use of Node, but what you're interested in. These are multiple choice, so select all that apply. We got a 0% on that one. Sorry, we may have a technical difficulty on that one, but I know we've got a lot represented today. So we're going to hit on really all of these use cases of Node today, and we're looking forward to all the questions and topics that are interested to everybody. So let's get things kicked off here. So, I'm not going to take a lot of time showing the ooh and ah stats today, but really no State of the Union of Node is complete without it. So to get us started, panelists, we've seen the numbers, and they're pretty mind-boggling any way you look at it. Node has crossed well over the threshold of 1 million downloads per day, and it's increasing. I think, in talking with you, Wyatt, yesterday, I think we were at 1.3 to 1.4 million per day range right now. And so it's continued its growth and adoption, as we all know, across web applications. It's popular in mobile and IoT, cloud-native applications, containers, microservices, serverless. Certainly an interesting observation from our perspective as a provider of Node support is that Node's momentum seems to be actually accelerating particularly well in, what I call traditionally conservative sectors like fintech and healthcare. And of course, I just really mean conservative, in the state that these companies typically are associated with being very guarded in their approach to the latest open source technology and production workloads. So, with regard to security, data sovereignty, and stability, I think that's a great indicator of maturity within Node. So I guess my first warm-up question for the panelists is that, we've seen a lot of the numbers. We have a good sense from surveys. We have, a word cloud of some tags of why Node is popular amongst developers. But what's not found in the data? What's not found in the surveys that the team here would attribute to the growth of Node and its continued adoption in the enterprise? Lloyd, I'll hand that to you first.
Yeah, great. For me, kind of when I first, started doing Node, what I really enjoyed about it is the obvious, hey, I've done stuff in the front end. I have these JavaScript functions. Like, can I utilize those same things in the back end? And it's been really, there's a lot of technology, being any computer person, right? And there's like so many things to learn, and it's kind of refreshing to be able to utilize those same skills in the front end that you do in the back end. So that's really big. And also just being able to share those source code bits and packages. A big one is obviously NPM, and doing that registry and reutilizing some of the same code packages and bringing that all together is really advantageous.
Thanks, Lloyd. Wyatt, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just echo what Lloyd said. It's definitely enjoyable to use. Something else to note is next month we get to celebrate the 10-year or 10th birthday for Node. So I think that kind of says that Node has matured quite a bit in 10 years, and 10 years is a long time for software. So with that, that's probably part of the reason why you see some of these other sectors start to adopt Node, just because it's stable and mature at this point.
Absolutely. Great comments, both of you. So just kind of moving on here to one of the more recent developments in the Node project and community, the news that the Node.js Foundation and JS Foundation are merging, right, with the new entity being called the OpenJS Foundation. From me, my personal opinion here is that this is an awesome development. I've been a participant in the Node plus JS interactive conferences, like the one in Vancouver last year. that was a great success. That was a lot of fun. There's a ton of energy there. So I would think that joining forces should provide a lot more opportunities for regional events and a greater opportunity for the creation of training. But I'm eager, as I'm sure many are, to learn more about opportunities and projects that this will create for the respective communities as the merger completes. So I'd like to again open it up to the panelists to get their early thoughts on the merging the foundations. And I'll shift this one to you, Colin, first.
Yeah, so I think this is a great idea. I think it makes a lot of sense for several reasons. So I mean, JavaScript as a language and then Node are kind of two sides of the same coin. I think it kind of consolidates a lot of information. So if people are looking for answers when they have questions, they kind of have one place to go to instead of multiple places. For companies, it makes sense because if companies are looking to sponsor one of these foundations, chances are they're using both technologies. So now they have one foundation to sponsor. And I just think that overall the community will be better together than the two were apart.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Wyatt, do you have any added thoughts on that one?
Sure. So I was looking forward to an initiative that the Node Foundation was doing around certification. So they were working on a Node certification, test, and I think that's going to be released this spring. And I'm hoping that now with the merger, there'll be a JS certification. So just something to provide reassurances for hiring managers that the candidates are well qualified and know what they're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're all eager to see developments in that area as well. So, okay, so we've hit on some of the successes of Node, the recent happenings of the foundation, but I think it's time to dive into some of the exciting stuff, right? Which is the future. And obviously, we have a lot of developers on the call today, so I think the next area of focus is going to be of particular interest to most of them. So, Colin, I'd like to ask you to take us through the current LTS release schedule, right? How the LTS releases work. And then also shift maybe into some of the go-forward work plan for Node v12. And just as you take us through that, we had some early bird questions come in from users that were asking about how to prepare for new releases or how to deal with or what they should do if they have versions coming up for EOL, as well as what changes may be in store with Node that could have impact to future iterations of their application. So just keep an eye on those as you go through. But Colin, I'll hand the mic to you here and take us through LTS.
Sure. So this slide shows the Node.js release schedule in both graphical and table format down at the bottom. The schedule dates back all the way to the creation of the Node.js Foundation. It tries to strike a balance between releasing often, which is what the community wants so they can get their hands on new features faster, but balancing that with the stability that enterprise users require. So the basic idea is that if you look at the very top of the chart, we have the master branch. That represents Node's master development branch. That's where all changes land, bug fixes, new features, breaking changes, everything can land there at any given time. And then periodically, which usually turns out to be every week or two or three, we create a release on what's called our current release line. So in this chart, it's shown in green. And the current release line contains all of the bug fixes and new features that land in master, but with none of the breaking changes. So right now, the current release line is Node 11. Twice a year in April and October, we cut a new major release line. So at those points, we kind of release all of the breaking changes that have queued up for 6 months. And this new release will then become the current release line. So odd numbered releases happen in October. For example, Node 11 last October. These releases are supported as current for 6 months. And then after that, they enter a brief maintenance period where they don't see many updates at all before going end of life. So for Node 11 as an example, it was released in October of 2018. And once Node 12 is released later this month, it'll transition into maintenance until it goes end of life in June. So we recommend for corporations and enterprises that they not use any of the odd numbered releases in production because they have shorter lifetimes and generally don't have the same stability guarantees. Now, on the other hand, even-numbered major releases, which are cut in April, become the current release until October. Then in October, they go into long-term support, or LTS, for a period of 18 months. So during this period, they only receive bug fixes, security updates, documentation fixes. They occasionally get new features, but it's not really guaranteed. In general, other commits that are deemed to be low risk. We deem things to be low risk by putting them out into current releases for 1 or 2 release cycles. Make sure that there's no regressions before we backport them to the LTS branches. So this is done mostly to guarantee the stability in the LTS lines. And then another, I guess, thing to note is that once a release goes into active LTS, it receives a code name from the periodic table of elements. So if you look at this chart, you can see node 6 is boron, node 8 is carbon, node 10 is dubnium, and then we'll come up with a name for node 12 sooner or later. So after 18 months of active LTS, these even-numbered releases go into maintenance mode for another 12 months, where they only receive very critical patches. So once a release line is in maintenance mode, it usually gets a release once per quarter. So there's not a lot of activity there. So if you look at the chart, you'll notice that node 6 is approaching its end of life at the end of this month. So if you're currently on node 6, we recommend that you upgrade to node 8 or preferably node 10, which is the current active LTS. And then you also notice that node 12 will be released later this month, and it'll become the next LTS version in October. So like as Sean alluded to, we'll come back to the changes going into node 12 in just a minute. But I wanted to take this opportunity to say that if you have any questions about what version of Node you think you should be running, feel free to reach out to us at any time.
Awesome. And you know what? Let's jump right into Node v12. And I have a couple of questions that I think that will follow along this one fairly well, Colin. But I just ask you kind of give us an outlook on what's coming.
Okay. So with Node 12 being less than a month away, we decided to go ahead and just include the link to the GitHub issue here. So that's github.com node.js/node/pool 26930. And if you go to that URL, you can actually see all the commits that are going to be going into the release, things that we are considering to be notable. One thing is you probably shouldn't get too excited about it. Every time I talk about major releases, I like to tell people that they're supposed to be boring, and that's by design. We try hard not to break things, and most of the breaking changes are things like removing old deprecated code that we've been saying is going to be going away for years before it actually happens. But one thing that I think is really exciting about this release is there's going to be a new HTTP parser switched on by default. So this parser is called LLHTTP, and it's set up to replace the legacy HTTP parser that is a bit of handwritten C code that's been around since the early days of Node, and it's kind of become a maintenance hassle for the maintainers. So LLHTTP is expected to be more performant and also easier to maintain for the core team. And then while we're on the topic of HTTP, so a little while ago, HTTP 2 went stable. And so with that, we're kind of moving on to HTTP 3 and Quick. So Quick is a new protocol that uses UDP to kind of improve performance over connection-based TCP applications. The next version of HTTP, which will be HTTP 3, as of late last year, has announced that they're going to use Quick as their underlying network protocol. So that's exciting. That's not going to be in Node 12, but there is a Node.js/Quick repository where development is happening right now. So if you're curious to see what that looks like, you can check it out. A really big thing that we get for every Node release is what version of V8 is it going to ship with. We're currently expecting to ship with V8 7.4, which has asynchronous stack traces in it. So if you've ever tried to debug asynchronous code in Node, for anytime in Node's lifetime. You know that when you do something like a set timeout or any other asynchronous operation, you lose the stack trace up to that point, and so that can make debugging a lot harder. There are modules out there like Long John that can give you asynchronous stack traces, but they come with significant overhead, and so you shouldn't run them in production. The V8 team was able to find a way around this and provide low to no cost asynchronous stack traces. So I'm very excited to see that coming in the next version. And then on the security front, we're going to be shipping with OpenSSL 1.1.1. That will be supported until September of 2023. So that will easily last the entire lifetime of Node 12. So everything should be good and stable there. Security-wise, we'll also be enabling TLS 1.3. So again, that'll just make your applications a little bit more secure. NAPI is kind of the new way to write compiled add-ons for Node until we come up with a better solution, hopefully involving WebAssembly. But NAPI kind of replaces NAN, native abstractions for Node, as the old way of writing compiled add-ons. NAPI is nice because it provides ABI stability, so you can actually write a compiled add-on for NAPI, and it should work across any version of Node that supports NAPI, which is currently all of the release lines. Previously, when you would switch versions of Node, you would have to recompile your module, and it was just generally a headache. So that's a little bit smoother of an experience for users now. Another big new feature that we added recently was workers. It's not out of experimental yet, but we're working hard to get it there. If you know anything about JavaScript, you know that it's single-threaded. So now, with the addition of workers, you'll be able to actually create your own threads without having to rely on something like the child process or the cluster modules, which aren't actually threads, or diving down into C code to create your own threads. And then another big thing that I'm actually personally invested in is improved diagnostics via process.report. So this will actually, you can configure this new functionality on JavaScript crashes, C++ crashes, when you receive user-specified signals or just through an API to create this diagnostic dump, which is a human-readable text file that includes things like your command line arguments, the versions of all your dependencies, stack traces, and environment variables, but just about everything else you would want to see without going full-blown core file to see what happened when your application crashed. And then we've actually gotten a few new features coming up from libuv. UDP sockets, or connected sockets, just landed in Node Core this morning, so I'm excited about that. And then development's underway for streaming readdir. That landed in libuv a week or so ago. Development is happening right now to get it into Node Core. That was a feature request dating back to, I think, 2014. So really excited to see that land.
Awesome. Awesome. And, there's a great question coming in. It's a good segue to kind of the next thing that we wanted to share before we get into more Q&A, Colin. And with your involvement on the security team and security-related development, we've got a question in that what's the best way to be notified of security releases other than following specific people on Twitter? And this actually is a bigger and broader question we've been hearing a lot of, and we're having certainly conversations at Joyent on ways to improve that flow of information, which we were going to speak to next. But Colin, let's talk about just security specifically and releases, CVs. What are the best ways to be able to keep aware of what's going on there?
So I think the simplest way that doesn't involve Twitter is to just if you can subscribe to the Node.js blog, nodejs.org/blog, or just periodically visit it. Every time there's a security announcement, we do a pre-release announcement to let people know that it's coming so that they can be prepared. And we try to give people at least a week or two of headway before the releases come out.
Okay, thanks. So there was actually another quick question when you're referencing workers earlier, asking like Cloudflare workers?
So when I say workers, I just mean lightweight threads. So you can create just actual C++ threads from JavaScript. They're not the exact same, but very similar to workers in the browser environment.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks. And back to kind of the awareness, we wanted to just provide a few, tips and links, obviously, for everybody to keep apprised with there. A couple good follows on Twitter, including ourselves. We're going to continue to put more emphasis on streamlining some communication that's important to Node users out there. But feel free to reach out to us directly. Give us your ideas. We're talking about some mechanisms like mailing lists and things that will streamline information. It's good to continue to hear from enterprises of how they'd like to get that information curated and provided to them. But the last thing I just want to leave everybody here with as far as thoughts on staying informed is certainly go look for a partner in Node support, right? There's experts throughout the industry here at Joyent, of course, and a lot of our peers that are very happy to help and sort of curate and be a guide through these through all of the information out there. So, but by using a partner, you're not only getting access to the experts in the field, but it's helping to continue to fund collaborators and contributors in the project and ensure your concerns and priorities are connected back to the core project and the steering committee itself. So we'll jump into some questions here, so please keep them coming in. We had a couple early bird questions that I want to address, and then I see quite a few more questions coming in here. The first question we had was so broad that I wanted to take this one at the top to help this particular user. And the question was, what are some operational best practices of Node we should consider as we move Node.js applications into production? We also had another question coming with questions around common mistakes, and so I think these kind of fold in together to try to address this at the same time. So obviously we have limited time today, but I'm going to hand the mic to you, Lloyd, as you have prepared some comments on this at a high level, and we could certainly follow up with users afterwards as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, basically to make sure you're operationalized, I mean, you got to kind of, the quicker you can do it, the better. Obviously, companies, we all have like limited resources, so you just kind of do whatever you can do. This is how companies work. But some kind of things you should think about are centrally logging things. So a lot of times we get, customer calls and things like that, and it's like, oh, we're having this slowdown problem or something, this thing keeps restarting, I don't know what's going on. And it turns out to be like an unhandled rejection error or something like that. They're not looking at their logs locally. And if you could kind of centrally locate those through like something like a Splunk or a Humio or an Elk Stack or something like that, it can be really useful, to have like, if you can alert based on like certain types of logging errors and stuff like that, it can really help you triage that stuff ahead of time. So then you don't spend maybe as much time like what's going on. So that can be very helpful. That's really nothing specific to Node other than the unhandled rejections portion of it. But just centrally logging is very, very useful for any application. Tracing is useful. This doesn't necessarily mean you have to like instrument every call in your app. There are, depending on the framework you're using and things like that, you can sometimes just inject some JavaScript into something or add a plugin or something like that. A lot of them are based on open tracing, but just knowing like exactly what's going on in your custom application is extremely useful. Restarts can be very handy. A lot of times it kind of starts out from a beginning of like, I want to prevent a DDoS-like attack, or if somebody's like beating on, or we're getting lots and lots of traffic and my thing is running out of memory or whatever, how do I help that out? And it's very common to use something like, if you're in Linux, you might be using something like systemd. A lot of people like PM2 for this kind of thing. I actually recommend usually trying to get as close to the operating system as you can. PM2 has a dependency on Node, so if you want to update Node versions, that can be not as ideal. And of course, if you have a problem with your PM2 process going down, as long as you're monitoring, you may know, but it's still more ideal for the operating system to do it in general. Node report used to be kind of the old way to do it in Node. Colin kind of talked a lot about this already. but it used to be node -r, and then it's a module you would add. Now it's sort of built in, so there's lots of great stuff, lots of good information that you can do that, and you can customize it depending on how often you want that, or based on the signal, et cetera. But Colin kind of mentioned that pretty well last time. He also mentioned a core analysis. That's kind of like the last hope. Something really bad happened. I really need to look at this, and maybe I'm not getting enough information. You can get a lot of core analysis and use tools now with like LL Node. Before you had to kind of use Smart OS or something get really specific, and that really has evolved a lot for JavaScript to look at those specifics. And then for Node specifically, there's metrics that you can get. It's really important to look at your event loop. That is kind of built into the newer versions of Node now. It's in the process. You can look at the perf. You can look at that, but it's basically the time you look at your event emitter, and you look at the time before and after those events. And if you see that it's starting to increase over time and not going down, that can be an indication that you need to do some optimization there. Heap space is also a really important one. You get like 1.5 gigs. So if you're doing a lot of objects or you're having leaks or something like that, you may see that number increase, and you want to make sure that it, eventually once you hit that 1.5 like gig threshold, your application will actually crash. Again, if you're automatically restarting it, great, but you still want to avoid that because things will get slower and slower as your garbage collector has to work harder and harder. And then just taking all these kind of metrics and monitoring them over time, and then you can write, monitoring solutions that say, okay, it's hitting this threshold. I need to page out, or I need to start really looking at this and get ahead of this problem. And just simple like, hey, my application restarted. It's great that we automatically restart it, but we shouldn't just ignore it. We should actually know that it restarted. Why did it automatically restart? So can we prevent it from happening the next time, and basic just up-down stuff. So that's pretty much kind of at a high level. And if there's any more specific questions, we'll try to handle that a little bit later.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Lloyd. Another early bird question that came in here that I wanted to bring up is surrounding async hooks for managing context here. I'm not going to read the full question out, as I believe our panel has seen it before, but wanted to hear some updates around async hooks and the performance hits, and if there's any improvements or plans around that. I'll hand this one over to Wyatt maybe to take.
Sure. So it definitely seems like they're on the right path with just adding additional logging around the requests. So the question is more around distributed kind of tracing and how you accomplish that with Node. So typically the way we've solved this problem is, adding additional logs and timing around, like, are we sending a request out? How long is that request taking to get a response? And then we've relied on a tool, or I guess a framework specification called Open Tracing, which is part of the CNCF. And it works in Node. It also works across a lot of other languages, and it's vendor neutral. So yeah, it'll work across all of your systems ideally. And so it provides some modules. One is just called Open Tracing. And then there likely are some Open Tracing specific modules for the framework you're using. So if you're using Happy, you could use a module called Tracy that I wrote that adds in these extra kind of tracing hooks, I guess, around your requests that are coming in and the requests you might be sending out. And then you can aggregate all that data into something like Zipkin or Jaeger and just monitor where you're spending your time. And hopefully that will provide some insight on how to improve performance and maybe where bugs are in your system.
Awesome. Thanks, Wyatt. Colin, I've got one for you. You've written about this and spoken about TypeScript, and we have a user that's interested in TypeScript, and in particular its relation with Node, and whether it'll affect the way that we would program in Node moving forward. You want to take that one?
Sure. So it definitely is having an impact. A lot of users kind of expect to have TypeScript typings provided with modules these days. It helps if you have if you're using something like VS Code for the IntelliSense. Long term, I would hope that TypeScript, the best things from TypeScript would be absorbed into JavaScript, and that TypeScript itself would kind of go the way of CoffeeScript. I mean, there's no guarantee that that'll happen, but that's what I would like to see. As far as using TypeScript, I blogged about this on the Joyent blog. It's a good way to get started if you're coming from a language like Java or C#, where it's kind of a very similar programming model. If you're coming from the opposite end, so from JavaScript to TypeScript, it's a little more overhead to pick up. You'll definitely end up typing more if you use TypeScript. It's not a silver bullet, so I've seen some really good blog posts out there that kind of describe, like, things that they expected to get out of TypeScript that weren't necessarily delivered on. And I've personally fixed bugs in other projects that we expected to be covered by TypeScript that weren't. So it's not a silver bullet, but definitely worth knowing today, I think.
Thanks, Colin. I've got another broad one here. Lloyd, I'm going to shift this one over to you. Obviously, we have a long and storied background with containers here at Joyent, but we have someone asking about best practices using Node in containers. So I'm going to put you on the spot for this one, Lloyd, and if anybody else wants to comment as well.
Yeah, kind of what I was talking about a little bit earlier with that, sort of like get it close to the operating system as possible. Obviously, if you're doing something in containers and Docker, that kind of thing, that is, you can tell Docker to automatically restart your processes and things like that. The only kind of things that you have to be a little bit more careful with Node specifically is it's generally good practice. I think there's some use cases where you want sort of the init process to not be Node. So you can use, I think it's Tini, Tini. And then Docker, I think, actually has one built in called init. And so you have to like call it just a little bit slightly different. But other than that, it's, like Docker is sort of Docker. And, one really nice thing about, I think it's really common to use like Alpine for your Docker images, and you get those containers pretty small in size. And then just kind of keeping up with the versions. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll kind of make kind of a core container, and then I'll have all the patches in my operating system and tied to a very specific version, and then kind of have that pushed out, and then have my Node application installed after that. And then whenever I feel like I'm ready to make another, like especially in the enterprise, maybe it's quarterly, I do another one. Like, hey, it's this quarter, I'm going to like get all my patches, get this new version, I'm ready to kind of test that out, and then I'm going to have a new version, and then I always just kind of import this kind of custom version. So hopefully that answers the question.
Great. Got another question, actually a little bit, not so much a question, more of an interest area here. We have somebody that was interested in Jamstack or serverless web apps and containers. So they were curious on how people were adopting some of those patterns and tools within the Node space. Colin, anything to comment with that one?
So I haven't personally used the Jamstack, but I am a really big fan of serverless. I think that Node is kind of a perfect match for serverless environments. It's a fairly small runtime. It starts up fairly quickly, so there's not as much of an issue with cold start penalties. And then if you really, really want to squeeze some extra performance out, you can kind of webpack all of your stuff together to cut down on the times from all the different require calls inside of your application. But every time I see like a new serverless platform announced, it seems like Node is always like the first or one of the first languages that it supports. So I think, yeah, like I said before, I think it's a really solid match there.
Great. I've got another one here. This somewhat goes back to the LTS discussion we had earlier. But what should I do if my current Node version is end of life? So current Node version.
So if you're running an end of life version of Node, you should start migrating off of it immediately. We do security releases as needed from basically from our OpenSSL dependency. So I'd be willing to guarantee that you're running an insecure version of Node at this point. So yeah, start migrating right away. I would recommend getting to at least the earliest supported version of Node that you can. So in this case, it would be Node 6. And then you're just going to have to do some looking at change logs and on the Node blog to make sure that there's no breaking changes in there. Make sure you run your test suite on the new version of Node to make sure that everything works fine. But yeah, definitely want to migrate as soon as possible.
And I'll add to that too, not specific to just the Node version, but it's really easy to fall behind on your dependencies on their versions. So, often modules get updated pretty regularly, hopefully. So I'd say one thing that you should probably get in the habit of doing is using a npm outdated, which is a argument you can pass to npm, and it'll tell you if any of your modules are outdated. You could use that or a hosted solution like Greenkeeper just to stay on top of any third-party modules you're using, making sure that you're up to date.
Yeah, I'll also add on that, just like, again, if you can do all that and then put it into like a CI solution, right? And say like, hey, if I run npm outdated, do I get any results back? And then alert me based on that, then it's really more convenient to kind of keep up with that in an automated way.
Awesome. Thank you all. Another question, I think a little bit back to Node v12, but what, if anything, is being removed from the next version of Node?
So nothing significant. I would recommend going back to the issue that we linked to earlier and just verifying for yourself against that changelog. But most of the breaking changes are either removing old deprecated code. So when we deprecate things, we decide we want to deprecate it, then we do a documentation deprecation, and that lasts for an entire release cycle. From there, we move on to a runtime deprecation, so you should actually see warnings being printed. That lasts for an entire release cycle, and then after that, if we decide that ecosystem usage is significantly low enough, at that point we can go ahead and remove the feature. So there's a number of those things that are being removed, nothing that I think should impact anybody. Then we still treat breaking changes to error messages in some cases. So for example, if the error message went from foo to bar, there was actually code out in the ecosystem that checks those. We're in the process of migrating to a new error system that would avoid all of that, but in some cases that's still the case. Other cases improve validation. So when we type check arguments that are passed into functions, they might throw an error where they didn't throw before, even though the function wouldn't have worked properly. So we can sometimes treat those as breaking changes. But as I said earlier, these major releases generally tend to be pretty boring.
Thanks, Colin. I've got a question. Is there going to be any Kubernetes support or framework, kind of like Spring Cloud for Java?
Not that I know.
Take that one.
I don't think so. I think that's Node doesn't generally tend to buy into those like large frameworks, especially not as part of core. There's nothing stopping anybody from implementing that in the ecosystem, but there's no plans for that in core.
Great. I've got a great question here. Speaking to RPC, it's a fairly long question, so I'm actually going to push this one out to our slide area just so we can view it here. So my Node project is the gateway component that translates the RPC protobuf API to REST, exposes it over different transports. So it gets bundled with C and server and is deployed through installers for our customers who use Windows. So what are some best practices for deploying Node code base in Windows environments? And any recommendations would be highly appreciated. Thank you. Anybody want to take this one?
I can touch on it a little bit. So one thing that I definitely recommend is making sure that any of the modules you're using are well tested on Windows. So fortunately, this fall, Travis CI added Windows support. So like in the Happy ecosystem, for example, we've started building all of our modules, or the main core modules, on Windows. And if you're going to adopt a module, I think it's just probably obvious already, but just make sure that it's tested on Windows and hopefully in its CI. Those are my thoughts. Colin or Lloyd?
Lloyd, I can try to answer a couple of things that I've noticed specific to Windows. One thing that I've always noticed is Windows is not case sensitive. So I've run into a lot of problems where like there'll be a file that it's included and it works in Windows, but maybe you're moving to a Linux environment and then that's case sensitive. So you can kind of have some issues around that with Windows. And again, if you're doing like a CI environment, a lot of times that can catch those kind of issues. I know that it used to be kind of older versions of NPM, when you had kind of a package dependency, that would get like really, really long. And then, the actual file system of Windows would sometimes have a hard time with that. But if you use newer versions of NPM, it kind of squashes those dependencies all in a higher level tree. And so that should help a lot with those kind of problems.
Great. Thanks, guys. To the user that asked, it has an issue with some dependencies that break when trying to move to an LTS version of Node. I just asked you if you could give us a little bit more specifics. We'll try to address on this call, or we're happy to follow up with you afterwards as well. A couple more questions here I get to. Can somebody on the panelists comment on the current state of safer buffers?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So I guess the history with that is Node for a long time has exposed a buffer constructor, and it works basically like malloc in C. It requests a chunk of memory, and then it just gives you back this uninitialized block of memory. And then due to it being wrapped in JavaScript, we've overloaded the constructor so that you can either pass in a number to get a block of a certain size, or you could pass in a string, and then you would get a buffer that contains that string. A few years back, it was reported that the WS WebSockets module had a vulnerability where it was confusing which type it was passing to the constructor, and so it was actually possible to get uninitialized memory sent back to users over the network, which obviously is bad. That memory could contain things like keys, certificates, passwords, anything else that you don't want to share over the internet. And so we've added new functions to Node to kind of work around that. So buffer.alloc, you can get an initialized chunk of memory. Alloc unsafe, which behaves the same way as the buffer constructor in as far as it's a little bit faster, but it still doesn't initialize the memory for you, but it's an explicit opt-in. And then buffer.from, which is the method that you would pass a string to get a buffer back from. So we have these new functions available, and so we'd really like to be able to remove the buffer constructor altogether because it's problematic. But it's just the usage is so widespread that we can't really remove it because it would just break too much existing code. And so every major release, we revisit the question of can we remove it yet? And as of Node 12, it looks like the answer is still no. There's still too much usage. So we'll keep revisiting it and eventually try to get rid of it. But as of now, it's still a problem.
Okay, thanks, Colin. So I've got a question from a user who's wondering if we should expect Node to stay important, remain important, once there is a prevalent WebASM on the client side. Do you want to comment on that?
I guess I would just say that, yes, I do think that Node will continue to stay relevant. Anything that happens on the client side doesn't really impact anything that Node does on the server side or in scenarios like serverless and IoT. I'm a big fan of WebAssembly, but it's not it's a compilation target. It's not a replacement for JavaScript. So yeah, I don't think that will it may impact it a little bit, but I don't think it will make Node become irrelevant.
Right. Another question here: what current documentation or materials would we recommend during an upgrade?
Yeah, I can take that.
Back to. Go ahead, Wyatt.
Sure. So usually I'll look at the change logs on the Node GitHub org and just kind of look at what version I'm going from and what version I'm going to. Unfortunately, there's not like a compiled list of all those changes in one quick file. You probably have to navigate through each of the minor versions between where you're from and where you're going to. But I think that's a pretty reliable source just to see what's changed and how that will impact you.
I'd just like to add on that, again, this kind of goes back to a point that Wyatt had mentioned earlier, is the more you can make sure you always have a little time to maintain your dependencies and keep up with versions. And this is true of really any software in general. The easier that is, and the longer you wait, the rougher that transition is going to be for you. If you kind of neglect software, it'll be pretty bad generally.
Thanks, guys. Okay, one last question I think we have time for here is just, again, this is, I think, a bit back to you, Lloyd, here, but what have we learned in supporting our own Node applications and as well as our enterprise customers' use of Node, and what are the common mistakes to keep up with here? So, I guess I'll just re-ask that question from earlier, Lloyd, right? So just what are some of the most common and recent pitfalls that customers are running into with Node that you've seen in production?
Yeah, and it's kind of surprising because, whenever we go on these Node specific support calls, a lot of times, again, it can be just really, basic operating system kind of stuff. So very common things are, and Colin can probably kind of has probably quite a few suggestions from a coding perspective how to do things more optimally, with clones and things like that. He can probably talk a little bit more about that. But from an operating system point of view, make sure your thing is scalable, right? Because horizontally scaling is really useful. Try not to have as much state, because ultimately you want to have kind of smaller chunks of code. You want to have your application run, and you want to make sure that when you add a new thing in your load balancer for your application, that kind of scales out linearly. So even if you have a problem, you can kind of at least add more servers and until you can kind of contain the problem and then go back. And again, automatically restart stuff. Making sure you're looking at all of your logs. It's really common for enterprises to I'm just going to automatically restart this thing whenever it runs into a problem, right? This is real common in Windows too. If you have a service, just reboot it, right? And so you oftentimes hide these problems and you want to observe them and get analytics about them. And you don't want to do it so much that, you're kind of causing performance, but you want enough insight to understand how your application is working. And the more you have of that, the better and quicker you can, react on that. And, you can even do some simple activities. Let's say you're replacing an application, and you kind of want to know where to get started. What can I get the most benefit out of replacing this with something like Node.js? You can use the strangler pattern. You can make a little proxy. In fact, when we were working at Walmart, that is exactly what we did. We made a little proxy and said, hey, what is this? I'm going to take this route definition. I'm going to say, this is how long it took. I'm going to hand it back to the server. And then I'm going to, how long did that actual route take? And then, over time, wow, this route really takes a long time. We should kind of optimize, like, for this API is taking like 2 seconds. We should, try to get that down to 200 milliseconds. Let's start off there and take that over. And then you can kind of start taking over little bits of these kind of things and take those statistics and start watching those over time. And getting, you don't have to start out like, oh, I have to redo my whole app. You can just kind of take them at small chunks. And that's kind of a good way to do it. Colin, did you want to mention anything about like maps and, more efficient ways you can utilize code that's real common?
I think you actually nailed the question, because from the majority of problems I've seen, they've been either infrastructure or overall architecture related, and not so much problems in the code itself. When the problem is in the code, you can usually do some type of profiling and see kind of where your problem areas are. But you should, make sure that you're using Node intelligently. So don't try to have Node do too much. Don't have it doing things like TLS termination. Try to serve static files from somewhere other than Node. Just general best practices like that. And then if you're then having issues with the code, then bust out the debugging tools.
I believe that's all the time we have for today, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up. First off, I want to thank our engineers for taking the time to tell us a little bit about what they do on a daily basis. Thanks to those in the audience who attended and provided some really great questions. It was really wonderful. I think we got to all the questions, but if we did not, we will be following up personally. We also will be posting a blog with the QA from this session, and we will also be sending the recording out to all attendees sometime in the next 24 to 48 hours. We will be continuing with the next webinar in this series in the next few months. And based on feedback, the current leading topic candidate is building APIs with Node.js and GraphQL, or something on gRPC. We want to hear from you, so please email us. Please email us at marketing@joyent.com if you have suggestions. We would love to hear them on future topics. And then also feel free to stop by our website at any time. We have a Node.js section and many resources on our production practices page. This does conclude our webinar. Thanks again for joining us. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Have a great week.
Take care.